Hi, this is Zach with Worn and Wound, and today we're taking a look at the Nezumi Loews. So Nezumi is a brand that we've talked about a handful of times on Worn and Wound. We've reviewed at least two of their watches. There was the Voiture, which was a vintage style racing chronograph, had a very kind of universal Genève feel to it. Very exciting watch, one that I think we all really liked, and it did quite well. Then they released the Bylene, which was a really unexpected watch that we also really liked. So that was a mechanical watch using a similar case as the Voiture, but it had a kind of a military dive theme to it. On paper, it sounded like it didn't work. In person, it was very, very appealing. Now we have their newest launch, the Loews, which goes back to the kind of the original concept that they started with, which was an vintage automotive inspired chronograph using a meca-quartz movement here, the Seiko VK64, and then using a very similar case, but still having kind of a different overall feeling and layout from the Voiture. So just very quickly, the biggest differences are the fact that the Voiture had an external tachometer here on it. This has an internal tachometer, so it's basically changed, from a bezel to a tachometer on the dial. And then it only comes in a bi-register design rather than a triple register design. And overall, I'd say the aesthetic is more traditional of this one. The Voiture was a little bit out there. It was a little bit aggressive. It was not the kind of traditional classic vintage style chronograph. This to me just is the opposite of that. This is, you take a look at this, that is going for a vintage style chronograph, and it's well executed, in doing that. Proportions are nice. The aesthetic is nice. There's a few different colors there's a panda one, an inverse panda. This one I found kind of quite appealing, so use this for the video. But you have, an inverse panda plus an inverse tachometer, so you have the kind of play of black and white there. They utilize a similar dial construction as they did on the Voiture, so those sub-dials are actually a layer below, so they're very deep set, very, a nice deep cut there rather than like a stamp down, which has just a nice effect to it, adds some dimensionality to the dial. And then you have, kind of simple elements. You have polished rectangles here, add a little bit of dressier look, maybe speak a little bit more to something like a Carrera than the UGs. You have syringe hands. It's just, it has all these elements that you kind of know and are familiar with. So just like I said, it just speaks to that classic vintage style. The case is 40 millimeters, 46.7 to 47 millimeters lug to lug. So very nice wearable size. The 40 millimeters here on the Loews feels bigger than it does on the Voiture because the dial itself is wider. But I don't think it feels too big. Certainly is a scaled up version of a vintage chronograph, but not oversized in my opinion. It's about 13.6 millimeters thick to a domed crystal. That was my measure. It was a little bit less on their website, so perhaps that is a difference between this being a prototype and the final. Their case design is very appealing. It's sort of a twisted lug shape, speaking once again to some of those classic chronographs, Speedmasters, UGs, etc. Just adds a little bit more of an ornateness to the case, which I feel like does a lot actually for the watch, because otherwise this could have felt almost a little generic just because it is kind of a common visual theme. But then everything here is just well executed and well proportioned. If I were to have one slight gripe with it, it's that the tachometer is printed on the same surface as the dial kind of center. That is, a lot of watches are done that way. I just personally like it when there's a little bit of a depth change between a tachometer and the dial, or just some sort of internal information bezel. I feel like that adds just, that layering kind of separates the information a little bit. And in this case, might have felt Might have made the dial feel a little bit more compressed actually, because here it just has that edge-to-edge look. That's really my own kind of personal griping. Because this has the VK64 movement in it, the sub-registers are a 60-minute counter at 9 and a 24-hour hand at 3. Obviously, the 24-hour hand being kind of odd on a vintage-style chronograph, but we've seen that time and time again. I'm still a huge fan of these Seiko meca-quartz movements. I think they are really the best kind of quartz chronograph movements out there. Particularly for this type of execution, because you have the mechanical feel to the chronograph. You have the instant reset, which is just wonderful. Nothing kind of drives me crazier than a slow sweeping reset. I don't know why. And when it's not running, then because of the VK64, there's no active seconds, so you have that very quiet, silent watch, which something like my Chronomatic from 1969 actually has no running seconds. Seiko chronographs have no running seconds. So, that actually, to me, feels appropriate to the time period that this is harkening back to. So these are currently for pre-order. They'll be, I think, available early 2018. The price in the US is going to be around $416. That's, converted from 355 euros. So that could change depending on the currency. So that's I think a very decent price for this watch. It's definitely on the kind of low to middle end for VK for meca-quartz watches. It does have a very kind of elegant look to it. It certainly speaks to kind of a higher end watch. Lastly, the strap. You have a nice rally strap here. Feels very good. I like this tan color a lot. I think there's black and dark brown as well. Definitely looks the part, having that vintage style to it. So yeah, the Loews, if you were into the Voiture, but maybe the Voiture was a little bit too aggressive for you, or you're just looking for a classic and, approachably priced vintage style chronograph, definitely check out the Nezumi Loews.